Welcome to the Deep Dive, everybody. Ready to get into some seriously interesting stuff.
Always.
Today, we're diving into the whole world of online speech, social media rules, and how they connect to democracy. We've got a pretty wild mix to work with, a heated debate from the European Parliament about their Digital Services Act, A&D, some classic writings on free speech, some going back centuries.
Yeah, it's a fascinating combination. It really highlights how these concerns about who controls information have been around for ages.
Right, so imagine a world where a tiny group of companies basically control what you see and hear online. Who gets to decide what flies, and what does that mean for democracy?
Big questions, for sure. And what's striking is how this debate in the EU is like a modern echo of things people worried about centuries ago. They've got this new law, the DSA, trying to handle the power of platforms like X, what used to be Twitter.
Right, formerly Twitter.
Exactly. But we're also looking at texts like Areopagitica by John Milton, written back in 1644 when England was freaking out about the printing press. It makes you wonder if some things never really change.
It's like history's on repeat, just with a digital remix. And this DSA debate is intense. Some members of the European Parliament are pushing for super strict rules to fight against fake news and hate speech, the nasty stuff. They say these platforms aren't playing fair and that it'll hurt democracy if we don't do something.
They're basically arguing that online spaces are too powerful to ignore now. They're pointing to real-world examples, like how harmful content can mess with elections, lead to violence, and just erode trust in the whole system.
Yeah, pretty heavy stuff. But others are totally against the DSA. They're calling it straight-up censorship and a threat to freedom of expression. They're worried the EU will have too much power and that different viewpoints will get squashed. It got so heated that someone even brought up Joseph Goebbels.
Oh, wow, Goebbels, that's a big one. I mean, he was the Nazi propaganda minister, so it's a pretty loaded comparison. It shows you how seriously people are taking this debate. But using historical comparisons can be tricky. The real question is, where's the line between protecting democracy and protecting free speech? It's not always clear-cut.
Absolutely. And it feels like there's this tug of war between personal freedom and the potential for harm, especially when these platforms are all about the profits, right? And it's not just governments people are worried about. Some of the writings we looked at warn about corporations becoming like Big Brother, too.
Yeah, that idea of concentrated power is a theme that keeps popping up both historically and in today's world. Think about those concerns from the EU debate about a few billionaires like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg basically controlling the information flow. It raises the question, are these companies like Facebook or X, are they a threat to free speech and democracy in the same way that some governments are?
It's wild to think that way back in Milton's day, they were struggling with the same basic questions. He was all about the free exchange of ideas, even if they're offensive, as essential for truth and progress. It's like the internet is our version of the printing press, and it needs new rules. What jumped out at you from Areopagitica?
What really struck me was this idea from Milton that even bad ideas, even harmful ones, should be allowed to exist. He believed that facing those bad ideas actually helps us understand things better and makes our own conclusions stronger. It's a tough idea to swallow, especially today, but it raises a really important question. Do we prioritize protecting people from stuff that might be harmful online, or do we prioritize totally open dialogue, even if it includes things we really don't like? It's a tough call.
It really is. And this gets even trickier when you remember the internet isn't limited to one country. We've got examples like YouTube having to block certain videos in places like Turkey and Thailand because of their local laws.
Right, it's a global mess. These cases show how hard it is to have this idea of a universal right to free speech when different countries have such different rules and values about what's okay to say. It creates this tangled web of clashing interests, and it makes it super tough to figure out where the limits of online speech should be.
Talking about tangled webs, we've also got that example of Yale University Press wrestling with whether to republish some controversial cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad in a book about the controversy itself.
Oh yeah, talk about a tough decision. That situation really shows the tightrope publishers and platforms have to walk when they're dealing with something that might offend people. Do you try your best to avoid upsetting anyone, or do you stick to this idea of open exploration of ideas, even if it involves touchy subjects? There are no easy answers there.
Not at all. And it's not just the big institutions calling the shots anymore. The whole information landscape has changed dramatically. Now you've got traditional media outlets side by side with citizen journalists and bloggers, and they're all fighting for attention and trying to shape the narrative. So whose rules should win in this crazy new world?
That's the million-dollar question. The internet has totally blurred the lines between who creates content and who consumes it. The old gatekeepers of media used to have a lot of control over what information got out there, but now anyone with an internet connection can potentially reach the entire world. It's a whole new ballgame.
And that brings us to this fascinating idea of the right to be forgotten, which has been gaining traction, especially in Europe. It's like this clash between privacy and free speech in the digital age.
Absolutely. The right to be forgotten basically gives people the power to say, hey, I don't want this information about me out there anymore, and they can ask search engines to remove links to it. It's this fascinating example of how we're trying to balance personal privacy with the free flow of information online. It's not an easy balance to strike.
Yeah, we even had that case where Google was ordered to take down links to certain information, which shows just how much Europe prioritizes privacy.
Hmm.
It makes you wonder, can we actually have both free speech and privacy online? Do we have to choose one or the other?
That's the big question, isn't it? Finding that balance means thinking carefully about what we're willing to give up. We want to protect people from having their personal info spread all over the place, but we also don't want to create a system where powerful people or groups can just erase inconvenient facts from the internet. It's a tricky dance.
So in this world where so much of how we communicate happens online, who gets to make the rules? That seems like the core of what we're talking about here.
Exactly. This whole debate about social media rules is really a debate about power. Who's in control of the information and why? We're seeing this play out in the EU, where they're trying to regulate platforms to protect democracy. But others are worried about censorship and shutting down different opinions. It's a conversation that affects all of us, not just politicians and tech companies.
It feels like we're just starting to figure out how to deal with this crazy, constantly changing online world. What do you think about finding the balance between free speech and being responsible online? And how can we make sure the internet stays a healthy, diverse place for everyone, a place where democracy can thrive?
That's the challenge, isn't it? It takes open and honest conversations, critical thinking, and a willingness to see things from different angles. There are no simple answers, but the stakes are incredibly high. As you keep digging into these sources, I encourage you to think about what resonates with you. What values are most important to you? What compromises are you willing to make? And how can you personally help shape a better online future? The conversation starts right here, right now.
It's amazing how these worries about online platforms feel so new, but they echo these power struggles from way back. We're asking the same big questions about who's in charge of information and how that affects personal freedom and whether democracy can even work. It's like we're replaying this whole song, but with totally new instruments.
That's such a great way to put it. The printing press, the telegraph, radio, TV, each time there's a new way to spread information, people freak out about censorship, propaganda, the potential for good and bad. It's fascinating that even though the tech has changed so much, those core concerns are still there, just like they were centuries ago.
Makes you wonder if there's some kind of timeless wisdom we can take from those earlier struggles to help us deal with all this digital stuff. The readings you gave touch on some really interesting ideas, like John Stuart Mill in On Liberty. He argued that we should protect even offensive speech because trying to shut it down actually hurts society more than letting it be out there.
Mill's whole argument is based on this idea that truth comes from this free marketplace of ideas. He thought that even opinions that are wrong or harmful might have a tiny bit of truth in them, and if we try to suppress them, we lose the chance to test our own beliefs and maybe understand things in a more complex way. It's a perspective that challenges us to be okay with being uncomfortable and even engage with ideas we might hate.
It definitely takes some guts and open-mindedness. Another cool concept is in Freedom for the Thought That We Hate, which looks at the history of the First Amendment in the U.S. The author suggests that free speech protections are most important when they're defending the right to say things that most people really don't want to hear.
That's a really powerful point. The First Amendment isn't there to protect things everyone already agrees with that's easy. The real test is whether it protects the right to say stuff that's offensive, controversial, or maybe even disgusting to most people. It recognizes that being able to speak freely is absolutely crucial for democracy to work, even if it makes us squirm.
It's a good reminder that free speech isn't about protecting what we like. It's about protecting what we don't like. And that's a huge difference. This idea that free speech is the foundation of democracy is also in 10 Principles for a Connected World. They argue that having access to information and being able to express yourself online are basic human rights, that we need those to build a fair and equal society.
Yeah, the authors of that piece make a really strong case for why internet access and free speech are basically part of what it means to be a citizen in the modern world. They say these rights are crucial for people to participate in civic life, hold those in power accountable, and contribute to the culture and ideas of society.
Makes you think about how we can make those lofty ideals work in the real world of the internet. We're seeing huge platforms like Facebook and X, what used to be Twitter, being accused of censorship and bias, while also trying to stop the spread of all this fake news and hate speech. It's a total mess.
Definitely a mess. There's this tension between the ideals of free speech and what happens when platforms can reach literally billions of people. It's a constant balancing act, and there's no magic solution that works for everyone.
The European Union's Digital Services Act is one way they're trying to deal with this whole mess. They're trying to make platforms take responsibility for what's on them, but also protect basic rights. But it's also caused a ton of arguments about whether it goes too far and restricts free expression.
The people who don't like the DSA say it gives way too much power to unelected bureaucrats and could end up silencing anyone who disagrees with the mainstream. They're worried that terms like disinformation and hate speech are too vague and could be used to shut down voices that challenge the powers that be.
On the flip side, people who support the DSA say that self-regulation just hasn't worked. They say that online platforms have caused real harm, and we need clear rules and ways to enforce them to protect people from being abused and manipulated. They're pointing to real-life examples of how online hate speech has turned into violence and discrimination.
It's such a complex issue with good points on both sides. Finding that sweet spot between protecting free speech and dealing with online harms, that's one of the biggest challenges we face today.
So where does all this leave us? What does it tell us about what online speech will be like in the future? Is there any way to make sure we have a vibrant, diverse online world where people can speak freely but are also protected from harm?
That's the big question, isn't it? The stuff we've read gives us some good clues, but ultimately the answers will come from keep talking, experimenting, and being willing to grapple with some tough, often unpleasant truths.
It feels like this whole conversation comes down to one big question. Can we trust these huge platforms to police themselves? Or do we need someone else looking over their shoulder, making sure things are fair, that they're held accountable and that people are protected from harm?
Yeah, that's the core of it, isn't it? It's the heart of the debate about the DSA and any attempt to set rules for online speech. And honestly, there are strong arguments on both sides. Some folks are pretty optimistic. They see these platforms constantly changing, tweaking their algorithms and how they moderate content. They say these companies want a good user experience, it's in their best interest, and that self-regulation can totally work.
But then you have the other side, the folks who are skeptical. They say, look, at the end of the day, profit wins. If there aren't clear rules and ways to make those rules stick, these platforms will always choose engagement and making money over doing what's right for people or even society as a whole.
And that's a worry that's hard to dismiss. We've seen it happen over and over, platforms being used to spread lies, amp up hate speech, even to push people toward violence. The potential for harm is definitely there, and it's not clear that these companies can fix it on their own.
It's kind of creepy to think about, isn't it? That a few powerful companies and their algorithms could be shaping how we see the world, influencing what we believe, even deciding what we do and don't see online.
And that's exactly why this debate is so important. It goes way beyond the tech itself. It's about power, control, and whether democracy can even survive in this new landscape. As we try to figure out this uncharted territory, we have to stay alert, informed, and involved in creating the online world we actually want.
So what can regular people like us actually do? It feels so huge. Where do you even begin to tackle problems like this?
I get it. The scale of it can feel totally overwhelming. But there are things we can do. Start by learning about what's going on. Read different viewpoints. Have those tough conversations and be open to challenging what you think you know.
So basically become informed citizens of the digital age, right?
Exactly. We need to get those critical thinking skills sharpened, understand how media works and how these algorithms and platforms are influencing us. We can't just sit back and take it all in. We need to be active in shaping this online world.
And part of that is holding the powerful accountable, both the big tech companies and the people we elect.
Absolutely. We have to demand transparency and fairness from the platforms where we have these online conversations. And we need to make sure our elected leaders are creating policies that protect our rights and build an online environment that's healthy and inclusive.
It's a good reminder that this isn't just about the technology. It's about us, about our values, our choices, and the kind of world we want to live in, online and offline.
Couldn't have said it better myself. In the end, the future of online speech is in our hands. It's on all of us, and we can't ignore it.
Thanks for going on this deep dive with us today. We hope it's given you some food for thought and that you'll keep exploring these really important issues.
It's been my pleasure. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.
That's a wrap for this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, stay curious.